Good morning. Welcome to Thursday Morning Torah, where we study Torah on Thursday morning. Hence the name. Creative, isn't it? If somebody out there would like to give $1 bazillion and name it the Schwartz or Goldberg or something other Thursday Morning Torah, please write me. Be more than happy to name the class after you for the privilege of funding Jewish education. I wasn't actually planning on making a funding pitch at the beginning of class, but now I have, and I hope that some of you will consider actually sending a contribution, especially those of you who do take advantage of the Sinai classes and so on. If you're not a member, that would be very kind of you. However, enough of that, on to Torah. I want to do two things today. The first is to just begin by noting that today is Yom HaShoah. It is the day on which internationally we commemorate the Holocaust, the greatest catastrophe. I think it is certainly in the modern history of the Jewish people, and probably forever in the history of the Jewish people, in which 1/3 of our people were lost in brutal and savage and unspeakable ways, and so much more was lost even than life, dreams, possibilities, and all of it is extraordinarily important for the world to remember, not only because it helps us shore ourselves up against other catastrophes that might befall us by understanding the precedents, but also because it is the very least we can do to the martyrs and victims of the Holocaust, is to remember their stories, and to the extent that we can, their names and their history. I also want to tie that in some ways to the parsha that we're studying today, which is Parshat Shmini. Since I don't actually have my phone, I won't be able to look, for those of you who are making comments on Facebook, until afterwards. So I'm going to rely on our staff, especially Rebecca Small, our program director, to pick them up and relay them through the chat if there are questions. But we're going to talk about Nadav and Avihu today. We are in Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, chapter 10. The parsha is Shmini, which means 8th, and it is the 8th day after the ordination of Aharon as high priest and his family. And on the 8th day after that, the following happens. Now Aaron's sons, Nadav and Avihu, each took his fire pan, which is part of making a sacrifice in the altar, put fire in it and laid incense on it, and they offered before the Lord an alien fire, Eish Zara, an alien fire. It does not say exactly what that is, which he had not enjoined upon them. And fire came forth from the Lord and consumed them. Thus they died at the instance of the Lord, Lifnei Adonai, or before God. Therefore they died before God. Everybody could have a different translation. Then Moses said to Aaron, "This is what the Lord meant when he said, 'Through those near to me, I show myself holy and gain glory before all the people.' And Aaron was silent." Now, as you can tell, it is a very cryptic story. It doesn't say exactly what it is that Nadav and Avihu did wrong, and it does not make clear why the wrong was so egregious that it merited their death. However, it also gives some hint that there's something more than simple punishment and death here. Because it says that, as Moses says, through those near to me, I show myself holy. It doesn't say I show myself vengeful or angry or punitive. It says holy. And so, as you can imagine, there have been a very, very broad range of interpretations as to what Nadav and Avihu's sin actually was. And I'll give you at least a couple of examples. One is that they were eager to take over from Aaron. It's like Aaron's the old man, let's usurp his position. They went and they offered something that they shouldn't have because they were anxious for advancement. And you know how young people are. And so Aaron was pushed out of the way by Nadav and Avihu, and God punished them for that usurpation of privilege. That's one possibility. Another possibility is that they actually tried to draw close to God in a way that was illegitimate. And because of that desire for closeness, over and above what was permitted, they were struck down. And this is an almost impersonal, like cosmic sort of reaction. And giving some credence to that is the story that is told in the Haftarah. In the Haftarah, Uzzah is, David is bringing the ark back. The ark has been recovered. David is bringing the ark back to Jerusalem. On the way, the oxen stumble. Uzzah tries to steady the ark and touches it and falls down dead. Very much like Raiders of the Lost Ark kind of theme. But Uzzah came first, just to establish precedence here. And so the sense is that Uzzah presumed on a boundary that he should not have presumed on. He shouldn't have touched the ark, and not supposed to touch the ark, in the same way that Nadav and Avihu drew too close. Remember that a sacrifice is called a korban. They came too karov, too close. And there is something about the almost radioactivity of God's presence that strikes them for their presumption in coming too close. Others have said that they were drunk. All of these based on some sort of textual hints, none that are very explicit. Obviously, there's even a rabbinic teaching that the fire actually consumed their souls and left their bodies intact, which is an interesting thought, that in fact it was their spiritual selves that were damaged by this. And all of it leads then to Moses in some way explaining to Aharon what has just happened. That is, God was showing God's own holiness through this act, and Aharon offering the most powerful of reactions. And Aaron was silent. Those of you who have read any of the Holocaust literature, especially Elie Wiesel, know that silence is considered, in some ways, the most powerful reaction, because silence is infinite. Words are always limiting. They mean what the words say they mean, but a silence, there is no limit to silence. Silence is what Chesterton called the unbearable repartee, right? There's nothing to say to silence. You can scream at somebody, and if they're silent, you've gotten nothing back. And what could Aharon say about the death of his children? Anything he would have said would probably have seemed less than, diminished somehow. and so he was silent. And there is a remarkable sort of confluence between this story and the story of the Shoah, the inexplicability of it, God's presence that we cannot understand, the way in which a fire, because Shoah means a Holocaust, like a Holocaust is a giant fire, or a whirlwind, but Holocaust in English is a fire, consumes the people. But there is also another theme that I want to mention, and this is actually the theme that I picked up on this week for the Torah column. And that is, at many peak moments in the Torah and life, there is disaster at the heart, or at least as part of what happens. Remember, this is right after the ordination of Aaron. And it's just like Moses gets to see the land, and then he finds out that he can't go into the land. David gets to bring the ark back, and that is the moment that Uzzah dies. It's true in mythology too. Icarus, the day Icarus tries out his wings, he plunges into the sea. The day Beowulf kills the dragon, Beowulf dies. There is something about the triumphal moment that carries within it the seeds of its own disaster. And when we say things like pride goes before a fall, we are thinking of that same trajectory. That is, when you see someone who's enormously successful, there is always that suspicion that there may be an end coming. I just recently read Trollope's novel, The Way We Live Now. And in it, he has a character, Augustus Melmont. And Augustus Melmont is a fabulously wealthy financier, probably Jewish, but that's a separate question about Trollope and the Jews. And I will leave that aside. It's complicated, the novel, in that way. But there's Augustus Melmont, who's tremendously successful. And sure enough, it all collapses and he takes his own life. And he is almost a template for Robert Maxwell, whom some of you will remember, the English magnate who also built a huge house on sand, looted pension funds, was thought of as extraordinarily successful, and then, of course, as the whole house of cards was about to collapse, either fell or jumped from a boat and died. And there is, again and again, this story of someone attains high office, for example. We've seen this with politicians, and they fall. Someone is enormously successful in any range of fields, and then they do something to sabotage their own life and success. So it's a very known pattern, and Nadav and Avihu exemplify it in this religious context, and the underlying part of it, which is the secondary part, not secondary in terms of importance, but in terms of steps to get to, is that lesson about peak moments is a lesson about life. That there is no unmixed life. That everything that is good also contains the seeds of its opposite and the reverse. The pandemic had things about it that were good. And we can all list them. Of course, it also had things about it that were truly awful and terrible. When a teaching that we mentioned when we're back in Bereshit, in chapter 24, one of my favorite teachings from the Torah, when it says about Abraham, Ve'erech Avraham Bakol, that Abraham was blessed with everything. What does that mean? He had such a tough life, right? Abraham did not have an easy time. He had famine. He had problems with his children. He had problems with his wife. He had, on and on and on and on. But it means God blessed Abraham literally with everything, with the good and the bad and the dark and the light, or as the Talmudic phrase has it, and then the song from Nomi Shemer, al hadvash v'al ha'oketz, on the honey and the sting, that you get both. that life does not give unmixed blessings. One can predominate, obviously. There are certain blessings that predominate, but that the untroubled ride through life is not something that any of us can have or should have. No, it says ancient Jews were too much close to God. That's because they were punished. No, that isn't. That that was what I'm not sure I'm pronouncing your name right. Marchez asked. No, that isn't the exact idea. The idea is not ancient Jews. First of all, it's only Nadav and Avihu that were punished specifically here. In fact, the truth is that most of the time, the ancient Jews were not close enough to God. They were far from God, and God had to continually bring them back. So I don't want to overstate the idea that that certainly not the people were punished for being too close to God. That's never suggested in the Torah, and I don't believe the ancient Jews as a whole were not punished except with exile in the Jewish tradition. But exile is a reversible condition. That is, they are punished with going away, but you can come back. One of the great theological dilemmas, of course, of the Holocaust is how could God allow that to happen to the Jewish people? However, I think that it's important to say that that same question could be asked about any injustice ever, right? How could God allow any innocent person to suffer? And granted that the scale, the enormity, and the Jewish people's feeling of connection makes it a particularly poignant question with regard to the Holocaust, but it is not a different question. It's a question of scale, but not a question of we understand why God would allow other innocent people to suffer, just not those innocent people. So without further exploring specifically the question of evil, I do want to emphasize this reality of the mixed nature of life that all of us have to contend with, and Nadav and Avihu are a perfect example, as is the Haftarah with David. It isn't only, remember, in the Haftarah that Uzzah tries to shore up the ark and dies, but also that David dances with the ark as he returns it to Jerusalem, and Michal, his wife, looking out the window, thinks that is inappropriate for a king. It's beneath his dignity, and it leads to a permanent estrangement between them. So even at the moment of triumph, even at the moment of joy, there is this chance for things to essentially fall apart. And that is more or less what happens. All of Deuteronomy chapter 28 is about blessings and curses. Yes, that is true. That's a slightly different question, although clearly related. But there's what's called the tochecha, the rebuke in the Bible. But there it's causative. There it's saying, if you do this, you will have blessings. If you do that, you will be cursed. I'm saying something slightly different, which is there is no life without blessings and curses both, regardless of how you behave. I'm saying something that is more like mixed about life, more in the manner of Ecclesiastes, which if you read it will tell you there is no life where you don't have curses and blessings together. No matter, you can be as wise as you want, you can be as careful as you want, you can be as scrupulous as you want, and nonetheless, life will show you both sides. And no amount of piety and no amount of care will relieve you from that inevitable double-sidedness that life reveals. And we all know this to be true. And in fact, it's not just that the double-sidedness, it's that they are deeply intertwined because the loving somebody invariably involves pain, How can there be any blessing to be found in the Holocaust? There were many blessings to be found in the Holocaust. Having said that, and I will tell you I'll tell you what I mean in a second. Having said that, remember that when you say there are blessings to be found in something terrible, that doesn't mean for a second that the blessings cancel out the terribleness, right? The Holocaust is overwhelmingly bad, but that doesn't mean there are no blessings to be found in it, right? There are blessings of incredible poignancy of literature that emerged from the Holocaust, of the state of Israel that was clearly accelerated, although I believe it would have happened anyway, but was clearly accelerated by the Holocaust. There were blessings of a very different Europe that emerged from the Holocaust, as opposed to the Europe that was this cauldron of awfulness beforehand. Could turn out to be that again, but still much better than it was certainly in the 1930s. Now, all those things are small compared to the enormity of the evil of the Holocaust. This is what Rachel asked. But there isn't anything that is totally black, and there isn't anything. I mean, look, I know people, for example, so they've lost a child, and they created a charity as a result of losing a child. Now, is there a blessing in that loss of the child? Well, yes, in the sense that they created the charity and wouldn't have otherwise. But obviously, the loss infinitely outweighs the blessing. And the same thing with the Holocaust. The loss infinitely outweighs the blessing. But that's not the same as to say that there are no blessings. Life is too complex and intertwined for pain not to bring blessing and for joy not to bring pain. It just doesn't. Whether Aaron, if Janet asks, could Aaron be punished for the golden calf? If Aaron is punished for the golden calf, then it makes it inexplicable why Nadav and Avihu would be killed. That God would kill Aaron's children for Aaron's sin is not the way I think the Torah wants us to conceive of God's justice. And it gives a specific reason that they brought this alien fire. So although in one sense it might make sense, I don't think there's any linkage about that specifically. And yes, as Paula says, without both sides, there's no compassion. I mean, this is an almost endless subject, but I think that it is certainly true that if you have no pain in life, it's hard to grow. I mean, I remember when I was remember if I was a rabbinical student or I was a rabbi in my first couple of years. So they invited me to come. Apparently they had a series of rabbis who came to the local Jewish Alcoholics Anonymous group. And they said, you'll come, you'll give a little Dvar Torah at the beginning, and then you'll shut up and you'll listen. And so I did. And I will never forget that one of the people who spoke said, I drank nonstop between ages 18 and 34. And when I finally stopped drinking at 34, I had the emotional maturity of an 18-year-old, because between 18 and 34, I felt no pain. I was always numbing myself. And because I felt no pain, I didn't grow. So yes, there is growth in pain. And yes, the fact that there is a modern state of Israel is some small tikkun, some small reparation for the enormity of the Holocaust. But of course, as is almost certainly true, could have gotten in Israel without that eternal black mark on the history of humanity and that vortex of evil that was the years 1938, 39 to 45. And especially on this day, when we remember it, I don't in any way mean to diminish the infinity of suffering that the Shoah has meant to our people and to the world, by saying that in every evil there are some blessings, because that is also true. And I'm sure that's why Aaron was silent, because what could he say? And yet in Nadav and Avihu's death, generations of Jews who've read the Torah have learned, have studied, have understood, have struggled. So were their deaths in vain? No. I mean, it carried with it messages that resonate throughout the ages. And the way, in part, that we create, it's not just that things have blessing, it's also that you create blessing. That is, if a genocide is prevented because we remember the Holocaust, then the Holocaust has done some good in this world. That's part of the charge of the Jewish people. Rose asks about Pardes. I don't want to specifically go into Pardes because that's a really complicated one, but the question of seeing God, that no one can see me and live, that's the underlying theme, absolutely, of at least one interpretation of Nadav and Avihu, that they drew too close to God and that is not permitted. And so they had some kind of experience which you could connect to the Pardes experience, but I will leave that alone for the moment. Those of you that want to know about the Pardes experience, which is a fascinating one, the best place to go, and I can't recommend it highly enough, is Milton Steinberg's As a Driven Leaf. The novel, again, it's called As a Driven Leaf. It will give you a really wonderful picture of the world of the rabbis, and Milton Steinberg was the author. Ryan, should we notice the pain that we may cause based on our own actions, and that pain came through a test of God? Example, Job. Well, the pain that we cause through our own actions is not a test from God. If we caused it, it's our fault. The pain that we feel, we may think of as a test, but not the pain that we cause. Now, I may be misunderstanding the question, but I would make that distinction. You are allowed to think of the pain that you feel as a test. I don't think you're allowed to think of the pain that you cause as a test from God. Maybe a test from you, but it's not a test from God. A test from God has to be pain that's caused by God, not by me. But all of pain can be conceived in some ways as both a test and an opportunity, but that doesn't mean that it is welcome or wished for, or that it is a test or an opportunity that we can meet or surmount. And some pain is so crushing that there's very little that one can do with it. And so, I mean, in the camps, are we astonished by the nobility of certain people who would give up food or bread? Of course we are. But do we condemn those who couldn't? No, of course not. Because you can't ask of somebody that they be almost superhuman, right? Most of us will not be, not in our own lives, and not an ideal that we will hold for others. So that's why I think to have asked Aaron, for example, to have affirmed his faith in God at that moment would have been superhuman. That he was silent is, to me, the most eloquent and powerful possible response. And I hope, if you did not light a Yortzeit candle, if you did for the 6 million, that's a good thing. If you didn't, I hope that sometime today you'll take a moment of silence and think of all those souls that were lost. And when you even imagine the accomplishments and the abilities of the survivors of the Shoah, just imagine what was lost in the camps, what creativity and wisdom and genius literally went up in smoke because of the barbaric cruelty, not only of the Nazis, but of all those surrounding nations where Jews were rounded up and killed. often by their neighbors and former friends, and the barbarity of the world at that moment is far beyond the capacity of human imagination. But as Abba even once said, the great Israeli diplomat, there are things in Jewish history that are impossible to believe, but there is nothing that is impossible to have happened. So on this solemn day, this solemn section of the Torah fits very powerfully and very well. And I hope that each time we commemorate Yom HaShoah, that the world will listen and maybe learn something from the tragic experience of our people, and how grateful we are that we live in a world with a state of Israel, so that we can understand what it is when there's not an Israel, and we can say with resolution and conviction and force behind it